there, how are you doing? Today we're going to have a quick look at infectious disease and the pathogens that cause it. So the aim of this video firstly is to kind of identify the main types of pathogen and kind of look over the key characteristics of each of these different pathogens. We're then going to begin to explain how named pathogens cause disease in the body. So this will be done through each of the pathogenic sections, and then we're going to talk about animal to human transmission and zoonotic infections, again with another example case study. So just to start off, some key words that we need to be really comfortable with. What we mean by a microorganism, when I say that word, is an organism that typically isn't visible to the naked eye. It needs a microscope to see it. So a bacterium, a virus, or a fungus. It's really important to note that microorganisms aren't all necessarily pathogenic. Pathogens specifically are microorganisms that cause disease. This disease is what we call an infection. So an infection is when an organism invades another organism's tissues. They multiply, and it's the reaction of the host tissues to this, perhaps in the form of toxins or physical damage, that leads to the infection. And what we mean by the host is the organism in which the pathogen lives and may choose to infect. Now, when we talk about infectious disease, what we mean by this is disease caused by pathogens as a result of invasion of the host. And infectious disease implies that the disease can be passed from person to person, so human to human, individual to individual. The invasion of the host is a key part of the pathogen's life cycle. So generally speaking, the pathogen needs that host in order to reproduce. That may be in terms of actually the reproductive process of actually building new pathogens. It may be to do with obtaining nutrition. We'll talk about some examples shortly. Symptoms and diseases tend to arise as a result of the invasion and the replication process. And again, it's individual to each pathogen and the disease that you might select to study. So what are the different types of pathogen that we need to be comfortable with? Well, I'm going to list 5. You can break them down into smaller subsections if you want, but for the sake of this, we're going to talk about bacteria, virus, parasites, fungi, and protozoa. Now, bacteria, these are simple prokaryotic organisms in that they don't have a nucleus, and because they're simple in the sense that they're able to reproduce really rapidly. There are some strains of E. coli that can reproduce every 20 minutes, and that means that they can proliferate extremely quickly. Now, as populations of individual bacteria grow inside a host, some of those individuals may begin to die out. Now, as they die out, sometimes they can release toxins. Sometimes these are toxins that are released from inside the cell, so they may be waste products of other processes, byproducts if you like. These are what we call exotoxins, and these are generally released by gram-positive bacterial cells. These toxins may then influence other processes, which we'll talk about in a minute. The other type is endotoxins. So endotoxins are cell wall components of generally gram-negative bacterial cells. Now, as the cells die and are broken apart by a process called lysis, what this leads to is endotoxins being released into the tissue. Now, toxins can have a variety of actions. Some damage cells, so they can cause cell lysis to happen in the host cells. They can disrupt things like respiration or metabolism, or they can prevent transport of substances across membranes. This leads to symptoms such as fevers, weaknesses, aching, diarrhea, muscle paralysis, and nerve damage. And again, that depends on the individual pathogen that you choose to look at. Viruses, these are what we essentially understand as pathogens that require a host to replicate. So the pathogen that we're talking about here is not able to divide by asexual reproduction or binary fission. They have to hijack a host cell to create new particles, new viral particles. And they do this by inserting their genetic material into the host cell's nucleus. In doing so, the host cell begins to build the components of the virus that are then put together by other parts of the cell. Now, eventually, the host cell will fill up with new viruses, and eventually they will burst. And these new viruses will flood out into the tissue, and each viral particle can infect then another cell to hijack it And over time, this will lead to the destruction of a lot of host cells and tissues and leads to the symptoms that we might associate with the viral infection. There's a lot of different forms of viruses, so if you do pick a virus to study, make sure you be absolutely certain as to which virus form you're looking at, and the way that it acts inside the host will be different for each virus. Parasitic organisms are generally eukaryotic in the sense that they have a nucleus. They have generally co-evolved over time to use a host for nutrition, shelter, or reproduction. And there are generally two types, and I'm going to hit on each of these in the next two sections. There are endoparasites, which live within a host, or there are ectoparasites that live on the surface of the host. They tend to cause physical damage, or they just drain nutrients from the host. And that's kind of where the parasitic term comes from. Generally speaking, parasites live their adult stages within a host, and they might lay eggs, and then these eggs may hatch into larvae that will pass into the environment in order to spread. And the spread can happen through perhaps contaminated water or food, or it can be sometimes more simple than that. It could be direct contact. What we tend to find as well is that some parasites do carry other diseases. So, for example, ticks carry Lyme's disease. And this can have a double-fold effect on a patient with a parasitic disease. Now, fungi are the first kind of group there that we talked about, ectoparasitic. Fungi can also be called Mycoses, and there are generally three classifications of fungal infection. Superficial, which means on the surface. This might be a skin-type fungi, like athlete's foot. Subcutaneous, and this is where it's present under the skin, so it may form in the muscle or in the connective tissue. And then there is systemic. Now, systemic fungal infections can be extremely dangerous because they can infect internal organs that are very difficult to get to without invasive processes. They can be primary in the sense that they can cause disease in a healthy host, but most fungal infections that are systemic tend to be opportunistic in that they generally hit upon people who are already immunocompromised or already ill. Protozoa were the other form of parasite that we talked about there, and the example I'm going to talk about is the Plasmodium protozoa, which is responsible for malaria. Now, this particular protozoa is carried by the female mosquitoes, where they generally are injected into the bloodstream directly when a mosquito bites. Once here, the Plasmodium protozoa will migrate to the bloodstream, into the bloodstream, and then into the liver, where they will begin to replicate asexually. Now, the liver contains a good supply of oxygen and nutrients, and things called merosomes will form, and these merosomes in turn will go on to infect red blood cells. And this is their way of essentially spreading, because the red blood cells will be picked up by mosquitoes and carried off to the next person. Now, for the patient that's suffering with malaria at this stage, they may not show many symptoms, but as those merosomes begin to replicate again, the red blood cells may begin to rupture. And as they rupture, the red blood cell count of that patient begins to drop, and we may see symptoms such as fatigue, weakness, and anemia. And the consequence of this can be fatal. Now, at this stage, what we're going to begin to think about is, where do pathogenic diseases come from? Now, the vast majority can be traced back to what we call zoonotic origins. Now, zoonotic means animal to human. So most pathogenic diseases will have come from an animal at some stage. Now, humans throughout history have had a wide range of contacts with animals through food, farming, and various occupations. And this particular image here shows just a range of different sources of zoonotic transmission. So it could be from pigs, it could be directly through pigs through farming, it could be through the consumption of meat. It can also come from veggies as well. So if you veggies and fruits, this could come in the form of maybe slurry contaminating a fruit, perhaps like a strawberry or a salad, or surface water that's contaminated. We can get it from shellfish. It can come from a wide range of wild animals as well. And there is suggestion that perhaps the current COVID-19 infection may have come from a zoonotic source. That's still being investigated. Now, there's a famous case study. So rather than talking about COVID-19, I think what we'll do is we'll talk about HIV. HIV has been studied widely in terms of its origins, and the origins are quite unfortunate in the sense that sometime in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, there will have been a jump from chimpanzee to human. So the Simian Immunodeficiency virus, SIV, will have at some point in this period of history jumped species. And when it may have done that many times in history, this is probably to do with the fact that there were people using chimps as bushmeat. So at some point, maybe some kind of cross-contamination of blood may have happened between a human and the meat of a chimpanzee. Studies have shown that patient zero, so this is the first person that had this infection, probably lived in a rural community in probably southeast Cameroon. Now, around this time, what we will have seen that would have been different to previous infections if this would have happened previously is that people were beginning to migrate to the cities like Kinshasa. Now, these cities were beginning to build ports and railroads, and there was a big urbanization project. And as this began to happen, young women began to follow from the rural areas as well, and a big sex industry will have formed in these cities. And as a result, HIV began to spread as well. And this can be traced in this image. So you can see on the left-hand side is where they think the Kinshasa would have, around the red area was where it would have begun to form. We can follow the way the railway would have been built over time. And as we move towards 1961, we can see the tracking of the virus and subsequently the AIDS syndrome that essentially would have followed from this. Now, it's worth noting that essentially two key factors led to the spread of this particular disease. The first being human behaviour, so things like unprotected sex and the sharing of needles, be that maybe recreational or medical sharing of needles, which wasn't necessarily seen as a bad thing at the time, led to the spread of the disease from person to person. What didn't help this is that, generally speaking, the virus is what we call latent or asymptomatic for up to a period of 10 years. So this is where the patient doesn't have any symptoms, they don't know they're infected, and they will continue with their behaviours. As a result, there are millions of people living with HIV, so 36.9 million people living with HIV in 2017. Estimates suggest that about 25% of them don't know they've got the disease. So you imagine how much of an impact that has on the spread. Now, about 50% of these live in Eastern or Southern Africa. So this is where a big concentration of the disease exists, and this can be as a result of poor medical infrastructure, lack of medicine, lack of understanding and education, and lack of contraception and birth control and things like that to protect people from it. Estimates have suggested that around 35 million people have died as a result of HIV infection. So you can see that zoonotic jump essentially has led to really devastating impacts on the human population. Now, this concludes the video for today. So hopefully that's given you a bit of direction in terms of what you're doing in terms of infectious diseases. If you've got any issues, give me a shout.